Eradication, Part 1, Extinction Protocol. When the Shrike first landed, we thought they were gods. They were apex predators in spacefaring ships. They came with tech and knowledge centuries ahead of our projected curve. They suffered neither disease nor deformity and possessed physical abilities beyond any species we had imagined. And they offered to help us. We accepted, of course. Gave humble thanks toward these deities from another galaxy. The things they gave us were amazing. Unimaginable just months before. Communication systems, food production, power sources, medical care, all revolutionized virtually overnight. Humanity was catapulted into a science fiction future beyond even the most hopeful optimist. Peace for all mankind. Global luxury. All they wanted in return was access to our medical records. It took a few days to fine-tune their translators enough to have a detailed discussion, but eventually we learned why. They were interested in our genetics. They told us bacteria and viruses were the most efficient killers among the stars. We knew what happened to our own from experiments in space, so we immediately agreed. Anything to repay what they had done for us. Other species, they told us, had a much more universal genetic code. This resulted in more uniform appearance, lack of meaningful response to progressive overload, and susceptibility to infectious diseases that couldn't be soon cured. They wanted to isolate the best traits of human genetic diversity. Immune systems, efficient metabolisms, athletic ability, all of it. The average person didn't really understand it. Those who did saw no problems. These perfect beings wished to take the human genome farther than we could have hoped for just a few months before. Our research with CRISPR initially impressed them, but within weeks their analysts were uncovering answers we hadn't had the questions for. Genetic engineering, gene splicing. Soon, we thought, physical deformities would be a thing of the past. After that, genetic sequences would be edited at will. Want blue eyes? Sure, we'll get right on that. Curious about your baby's height before it's out of the womb? One sec. Showing promise as an Olympic competitor? Let's make sure you reach your full potential. The Shriek wanted to learn the secrets of our biology. Anything you want, boss. They told us our planet was brutal. High gravity, low oxygen, hot. A prison 1,000,000 light years from the nearest FTL jump point. We begged them to take us among the stars. They refused, citing our circadian rhythm, evolutionary efficiency that stripped our bodies of muscle and bone in 0G, and inevitable development of cancer. They needed more time to perfect our species, to make it safe for us. Of course, anything you need, any volunteer, any experiment you want. They pushed us hard. People got sick or hurt or disabled. But it was always fixable, always temporary, and the money was insane. Besides, they were ever closer to letting us out of our solar system. Until it wasn't fixable and that kid died. Tragedy, horror, humanity in mourning. Audits, reviews, ethics committees. They were so close, latest statistics had stage 4 pancreatic cancer survival rate at 85%. The Shriek were tried in the court of public opinion and ordered to continue. So they did. Then the second died, and a third, then a 10th. Then someone went missing. The first protest was peaceful. The next one was not. The rich didn't care. They were living in ostentatious luxury. But if you weren't in that top tax bracket, sometimes you had to make the choice of your kid eating or selling yourself into the Shriek's research facilities. And at this point, it was starting to look like we were never any closer to boarding their ships. Next were the genetic casts. Mandatory DNA testing and genetic sequencing. Your worth was determined by test results conducted at birth and tied to your personnel file. At first, everyone said it didn't matter that much. But it wasn't long before kindness and compassion didn't extend far enough to cross differences no one would have ever known existed before the Xenos came. Unimaginable extravagance at the top, human lab rats at the bottom. Everyone says they're basically good. They'd never stand for such atrocities. But we did. Whether fear, self-preservation, trying to protect others, or good old-fashioned greed, we all stood idle. We'll carry that shame forever. Every one of us. For every human who suffered. If the Shrike hadn't made their next move, we'd still be their slaves. Or puppets. If they'd bothered to think of us as more than animals and learned a little history. But they didn't. They could have implanted a chip somewhere. Scanned it with something at every checkpoint. But no. The Xenos tattooed it on our arms. Doesn't get any more black and white than that. Spec Ops teams raided one of their research facilities. Rescued their subjects. No, they rescued our humans. Burned the data. Lost 14 of our own. But we killed 6 Shriek. And we discovered what they'd really been working on. Turns out, humans are possibly the most all-around adaptive species among the stars. Obscenely high shock resistance, incredible physical endurance, impressive immune response, hyperactive scar tissue. We're durable. Straight up kill us or we'll be back. They wanted to meld the offensive capabilities of a Shriek warrior with the defensive abilities of a human. Engineer a super soldier on an intergalactic scale. Now we were ready to stand against the Shriek. Even the puppets motivated by greed came down from their high castes once they realized the Shriek weren't going to keep up the facade much longer. The war went about how you'd expect. Shrike tech was still centuries ahead of anything we had. And they had a fleet. Hard points were obliterated with orbital strikes. Ground forces mopped up whatever remained. Populations were disarmed. Guerrilla warfare was met by brutal suppression. Imprisonment in their facilities. Thousands were executed. I'd like to say we fought the good fight. We held off as long as we could. Tried to preserve every human life. That we kept our doomsday weapons as a last resort. But we only lasted a week and a half before the nukes dropped. The first strikes were surgical. Planned in advance for minimal loss of human life. Carefully evacuated strike points to only hit the Xenos. They didn't work. During the reprisals, the Shriek gloated that nukes were old tech in the galaxy. A threat only to completely unprepared civilian centers. Of course, we did the rational thing us humans are known for, and immediately dropped every nuke we had, successfully transforming 1/6 of our planet into an uninhabitable wasteland, and killing maybe 24 Shriek outside of their shielded zones. Western Europe was hit hardest, where the Shriek first landed, transformed into research farms for their laboratory subjects. You were either an experiment or starving to death. Japan surrendered after a 3-hour bombardment razed half their country. The joint US-UK's fleet and air force defended the coast of that little island against the first waves of ground forces successfully, but was forced into submission when the Shriek parked a few battleships in close orbit. Most of South America was conquered within a month. China held for 8 weeks and 60 million casualties. The United States officially offered their surrender 4 days later, most of the eastern seaboard a smoking ruin, and over 20% of the country scorched into an irradiated dead zone. There was no facade now. We were nothing but fodder for them to dig into our genetic source code. But you've got to straight up kill a human or he's going to survive. We're adaptive, durable, tough. It's proved in a laboratory setting. It started with Russia, the only country that had not yet fallen to the Shriek, the country the Xenos couldn't break. Russia's dead made China look like a playground shoving match. The reason they never offered their surrender was probably because there wasn't enough military infrastructure left to do so. The Shriek glassed almost 150,000 square kilometers from orbit. The Russians, unimpressed, nuked twice that in the face of the Shriek advance. Instead of a blitzkrieg, the Xeno ground forces found themselves slogging through radiation dead zones, extending thousands of kilometers in every direction. Nukes were old news on a galactic scale, didn't make the fallout any less deadly. Our planet was already bombarded with harsh amounts of radiation. Now the Shrike got a front row seat to the man-made stuff. Scorched Earth on a scale that altered the global climate. Orbital bombardments hammered the surface, exterminating any sign of resistance while the Shrike warfront steadily advanced northward. Human survivors fled, leaving behind a landscape devoid of anything but ice and dirt. Supply lines were lengthened to reach the front. Forces were stretched thinner to control greater territory. Frigates and cruisers were redeployed to provide overwatch. The humans dug their way deeper into the approaching Russian winter. Freeze your horns off, Xenos. We didn't win a single engagement in Russia, but it proved the Shriek weren't all-powerful. They weren't gods. Cruisers were pulled to the front, leaving holes in the Shrike defensive perimeters. That let the next step happen. In France, suicide bomber with a backpack full of Semtex took out a communications array. It was down for 142 minutes. Enough time for La Resistance to isolate and destroy a military convoy. Molotov cocktails and homemade clubs. 38 dead. Martyred. Riots sparked across the earth, flared into rebellion, ignited into an inferno of righteous anger. They treated us like animals. We were consumed with vengeance and backed into a corner. They should have cut their losses. They'd stolen enough data to keep their scientists busy for decades. Should have retreated into their capital ships and liquefied every trace of our species. Melted our planet into slag and jumped an FTL lane so far away, no other species among the stars would have ever heard even a whisper of our system. That's what we expected. Once they didn't, well, guess we figured out we had nothing to lose. Better than we deserved. The Shrike didn't evolve on our planet. We did. They were unbeatable in their cities, untouchable within their population centers, watched over by looming battleships and shielded with their tech. But they learned quickly not to stray too far from their weapons and armor, nor to follow us into the extremes of our world's environments. Whatever your stance on gun control before the Xenos came, you were a firm proponent of the Second Amendment after. Good luck taking firearms from a people whose culture was almost synonymous with owning one. Or several. There were more than twice as many as people at that point. A rifle behind every blade of grass. Shrike ground forces disappeared with disturbing regularity in the Appalachian Mountains, no matter how many times orbital bombardment rearranged the geography. The Xenos spent about 40 minutes up north around Wyoming and the Dakotas before they decided it wasn't worth it. Down in Texas, they'd have to pull a cruiser for Overwatch just to take a piss. Or in Australia, a Shriek warrior would go missing. A few days later, they'd find him staked out in the desert. It's not pretty what UV rays do to Shrike scales. Even less pretty what happens when we started experimented with the local wildlife. Good luck securing 500,000 square kilometers of desert, Xenos. South African poachers switched from rhinos to shriek horns. Northward, warlords marked their territory with lead. In the Middle East, we took a break from fighting each other to putting IEDs to better use. South American cartels climbed ever upward toward new heights of sick brutality. Crime syndicates kept their presence well known. But that didn't change how ill-equipped we were to deal with aliens from the future. We weren't winning. We weren't even holding our own. We were just dying slower. People were becoming resigned to their fate, accepting the judgment of God for our sins. Still, the worst sinners among us were busy, working to transform the world into a hell worse than the one we were going to. Spawning acid rain, poisoning crops, engineering radiation storms, rigging the mantle with enough thermonuclear weapons to trigger impending natural disasters. Yellowstone was spectacular. There were still a few points with enough tech remaining to begin industrial-level depletion of the ozone layer. Not to mention the mad scientists who began unleashing their creations about this time. Bioweapons and the like. Made Unit 731 look like a humanitarian effort. I'd like to meet the degenerate who designed Malaria E2. Even with the virus samples from their research before the war, still took a long time for the Shriek to figure out a vaccine for that one. They were unbeatable in their cities, untouchable within their population centers, watched over by looming battleships and shielded with their tech. Our attempts to change the globe were far more effective against our own. They had blood and tissue samples from every significant civilian population on Terra, archived every malady we faced, a small step to develop vaccines to our enhanced strains. Current samples, civilian populations, susceptibility to infectious diseases that couldn't be soon cured. They told us bacteria and viruses were the most efficient killers among the stars. If they bothered to think of us as more than animals and learned a little history, put that together and we had our ultimatum. Leave with your lives or die on this tiny rock with us. They laughed. Well, so did we, and spread our judgment day across the planet. Hemorrhagic smallpox slipped into their population centers by human carriers, bioengineered with longer incubation periods, antiviral resistance, and nearly 3 times the lethality of the kind that plagued our species. First disguised as toxic gas and mixed with the original, so the longer incubation period of the new stuff had time to spread to the reinforcements they called into close orbit. Billions died too quickly to develop cures, and as we choked on our own blood, we kicked Shriek corpses through the dust. Genetic diversity ensured a few of us were still living, enough to watch Shrike capital ships fall from the sky like shooting stars, enough to jeer and snarl as we watched their cracked hulls limp out of our system. Enough to wrest the secrets from the broken Shrike tech left behind. Within months, we had completed the construction of our first ship and designated it the Mark I Dreadnought of the Terran Assault Fleet. Yeah, Terran AF. Then we stumbled across jump drives. Xenos relied on relay stations and jump points to access FTL lanes. We could generate a wormhole at any point in space. Also, we figured out how to get the sensors to start feeding info into the targeting systems before we dropped from hyperspace. Simply put, we could fire before we got there. And catapulted railguns can reach 0.1% C. We were omnipresent gods of the void. And we were not merciful. The Vengeance-class dreadnought made its jump into Shrike homeworld void space with a belly full of nukes, skipped past the defensive perimeter into the completely unprepared civilian centers. Jump-slung mass drivers crippled 2 capital ships, Dreadnought dropped in to glass the world, destroyed a frigate and another capital ship on the way out, and sustained only a single broadside, which inflicted 35% casualties and $80 billion in damage. Flush with our victory, we immediately tried to go toe-to-toe with some ships of the line and got reminded that a mid-sized Shrike shipping company boasted more firepower than our world. Frantic repairs got the Vengeance void-worthy again. We made another jump as soon as we could. Only stayed for a few seconds, just enough to let the Shriek know we were still out there. Just enough so they pulled back into defensive formations around their homeworlds. Just enough for Terra to draw one deep breath. The radiation-seared hellscape of our world was transformed into a factory that forged the fodder for Terra's war machine. A never-ceasing production line of durasteel and depleted uranium. The Martian manufacturing facilities took all of 2 months from their inception to the completion of the first Gladiator from the construction bays. I heard that at the end of the shrapnel rain, the drive yards were spitting out a heavy bomber every 90 minutes. That's the power of German engineering. Has a completely different meaning when it's stamped on the hull of a marauder. We couldn't trade broadsides with the Shriek, but we could jump anywhere we wanted. Despite the inaccuracies over such incomprehensible distances, we got good at it, stinging like a wasp until our first strike force was ready. Terra had jump drives, but the Shriek had numbers, tech, resources, and 2 planets. The only option was a garrote crushing the life out of the Shrike's throat. The only question was how long the wire could maintain its strength. Because to let the Shrike draw breath,